way and allow states to regulate cannabis appropriately in each of their jurisdictions.
And alcohol, of course, some states have state monopolies still. Is that acceptable to your members for cannabis?
No, I don't think that, for the same reason we wouldn't want to see a big tobacco type takeover of cannabis. I don't think that it should be monopolized by the taxpayers either.
Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to go to another constituency. Graham advises philanthropists who are in this game not to make a buck, but because they believe this is the right thing to do. What do the folks you advise think of the perfect legalization looking like?
Well, I think there's not one answer to that, Keith. I mean, in the sense that it's a group of diverse individuals, but some of the things they have in common are the idea of freedom, of that there should not be prison or arrest for people who use or grow or sell cannabis. So I'd say that's the uniting factor. So the half steps of sort of what's happened in D.C. would not be good enough. It's a step in the right direction. Likewise, medical marijuana, not enough. I don't think that most of them are particularly attached to questions about the structure of the industry, except that I think some of them are very interested in, I mean, Aaron mentioned, we don't want it to be big tobacco. Some of them are very attached to the idea that we should do things to encourage the emergence of an industry that is ethical, that is responsible, that isn't big tobacco, and where we don't have sort of the contentious, you think of the history of the FDA trying to kind of control tobacco to put that genie back in the bottle in a sense. Let's get it right from the outset and see if we can foster the creation of an industry that obviously seeks to make a profit, but does so in a way that is cognizant of the harms that marijuana can cause if it is misused. So finding that balance. And so some of the work we're doing is not just about winning elections, but also trying to make sure implementation happens in what we see as the correct way.
Thank you. So Aaron speaks for the industry, and Graham is spoken for philanthropy. Let me ask you, who speaks for the dude? Who speaks for the guy who has a rug that really pulls the room together and just loves smoking pot? And doesn't know industry, doesn't know regulation, but just thinks pot is great and it makes him happy, and he thinks more people should smoke it. That core of people have been at the heart of this movement for a very long time. Do any of you feel you speak for the dude?
Normal characterizes themselves, that organization characterizes themselves as the consumer advocacy organization.
So is that, let me ask you, Rob, you run a major organization in this space. Is that an important part of your constituency or no?
Yes, it is. I didn't leap to the grabbing the mic when I heard the word dude, but in fact,
I just love that movie.
Yeah. When we're drafting legislation, we do in fact look at it from the perspective of the consumer. And so, one reason that we're able to come to the conclusion that it's fine for marijuana to be regulated like alcohol and sold and grown in the for-profit sense is if you just look at our society and what consumers demand. Let's look at just any range of products. Let's look at restaurants. We're all familiar with restaurants. It would be odd if there was some kind of push to have all restaurants be government-run or restaurants be nonprofit. We're very comfortable in our society to have restaurants be for-profit with all the competition that goes with that. Even though restaurants, specifically fast food restaurants, do in fact cause massive public health problems, right? But we're still okay as a society to have McDonald's run as a for-profit entity and then let consumers decide. One of the things that consumers care about is that the location of the retail outlet should be near them, whether it's a restaurant or a marijuana shop or an alcohol shop or a bar or what have you. They want locations, the retail side, to be close to them, even if they don't care where the manufacturing is. So yes, we do care about the consumer perspective. We want it to be for-profit. People want to operate as nonprofits, that's fine. Most would choose not to. And we want the locations at the retail level to be numerous so that patients or recreational users don't have to drive halfway across the state to purchase their product.
And so is that your main objection to a nonprofit model, like having a public interest corporations or co-ops, so there just wouldn't be enough outlets? Is that your assumption?
Well, in theory, you could have thousands of nonprofits selling marijuana, but ultimately, as a society, I think we've reached the conclusion that having that vigorous competitive process with various for-profit businesses will end up producing products that are more to the liking of the consumer.
So better quality, more choice, those would be the things, yeah, you would emphasize. Kristen, you represent a lot of these businesses. What's your, you and your clients, what's your perfect legalization? What do you want to see?
It's an interesting question. For me, there's no perfect legalization. We've done work in other countries, and we certainly say, just because this is how we do it in Colorado, the United States, this is not, that doesn't mean that's what you guys, you should be doing down here. One of the biggest things when we talk about the Colorado model, what I say specifically is that the Colorado model is actually bringing a diverse group of stakeholders into the process and making sure that everyone has buy-in in that process. That included mostly people that were against Amendment 64 originally during the government's Amendment 64 task force, but it's evolved into bringing in the business community. Going back to the last point, when you talk about, and really generally what this whole topic, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how it actually works on the ground, sort of how lobbying, that there's this, there will arise the industry lobby, and being the new big tobacco or whatever that that organization, that somehow those lobbying groups or those constituencies don't have to act in concert with the broader business community. And when you have a movement for from an environmental perspective, or just generally businesses how they're operating generally, the concept of the triple bottom line, and bringing in community and how our business in this over corporatized world impacts communities. All of these things were not discussed in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, 70s when you talk about the emergence or really some of the worst actions going on with big tobacco. That was at a time where information flowed much differently, and the way that you build coalitions to get things done was very different. So in Colorado, we have, right now I'm lobbying at the state level on a number of bills, and right now in Denver, a very significant thing is happening in Denver. And the way that we're going to get things done is not because we exert power through money and hiring as many lobbyists as possible. It's by approaching it from a good government perspective and saying, these are good policies are good for business. That then brings in the larger business community. So there's a natural check on over-commercialization, because what is bad for business will ultimately not build the coalition we need to pass various laws. It's happening right now, and the idea that the emergence of one industry having a certain amount of power will then be able to exercise that power without addressing how it impacts the broader business community or the broader community. I just think it's a vast oversimplification of how this actually works.
And have you been involved at all with Uruguay? So you do international work?
Yeah, so when Uruguay was first considering their law, my business partner Brian Vicente went down there and spoke to them about messaging campaigns and just spoke generally about how it works. I went down there with Barbara Brohl, who's the director of our Colorado Department of Revenue. She is the licensing authority in Colorado, which is who gives you your license and takes it away if you or fines you or does whatever. She's the cabinet level official. And Dan Pabon, some of the legislators that did it, we went down and we just did 3 days of meetings with regulatory people to talk about what works, what is smart regulation versus, even if you take the commercialization discussion out, you have to create efficiencies if you're going to run a government monopoly. You have to create efficiencies in order to compete with the black market.
And so, since you know that system so well, I wonder, would you object to that kind of system in the United States? A more controlled system versus a more free market system?
I wouldn't object to it, but it's just not reality. There's never going to be a system where our government is the producer and seller. What you're talking about is a state-run liquor store model. The state of Virginia does not have a distillery where they put their products on the shelves.
Right.
Yeah, maybe they will at some point, or maybe there are, I don't think it's going to happen. So even if there was a cannabis...
Let me just pin down a little bit. Meaning it's politically infeasible, or that it just couldn't work? I mean, people would vote for it, or it just wouldn't work?
I just don't, I mean, I really just, it doesn't reflect sort of American values and the American system. Is it a good idea? Should we take everything, all of the values behind that and try to think about how we can incorporate that into our system? Absolutely. But it's just simply not going to be a reality that the government produce and sell product at a price that's lower than the black market. That is the idea down there. We will undercut the black market by producing, by scaling and having producers, private producers perhaps, but then selling it through, having the government sell it and do so at a loss in order to disrupt black market activity. I just don't think it's a reality.
So I think we have a risk of...
But when you make marijuana legal and put it in the hands of private, profit-driven businesses, the way that any business, a marijuana business, a lettuce business, a restaurant, any business, the way that they operate and make a profit is to increase demand for their product. And this is a different kind of product. Rob made the comparison to restaurants. Every restaurant sells food, but not every restaurant sells alcohol because it's a different type of product, and so it's subject to different type of regulations. We shouldn't regulate marijuana just like we regulate any other commodity because it's not like any other commodity, it's a drug. So, my view was always that, this should be ideally put in the hands of nonprofit businesses that are strictly regulated, B Corps, maybe tri-state monopolies. We have a grow and give model in DC that works relatively well. I'd like to see states experiment with a lot of different models and see what works best, what kind of lessons we can learn. And that was always my view, but it didn't really matter in the early days. In the early days when I first went to work at MPP, we were just talking about whether marijuana should be legal or not legal. And so in that sense, we were all on the same team. But now that we're down to the nitty-gritty, now that marijuana legalization looks to be more or less inevitable, now that we're talking about how to implement this, the details matter. And so, being in an organization where the default was the commercial for-profit model, and that's not something that I supported. It was just sort of, we're no longer on the same team.
Did it surprise you that it came to that point with commercial for-profit? I mean, because one reaction might be, well, we are a free market society, very entrepreneurial. Wouldn't this be expected that would be the end result of legalization?
It didn't really surprise me, I will say it crystallized for me. I remember very clearly when the Ohio initiative was being circulated. Everybody here knows the details of the Ohio initiative. It had 10 growers. Some people call it a monopoly, more likely, the better term is an oligopoly. And, it was people all over this movement. I know Aaron struggled with how to message around it. I know, Graham and DPA struggled around how to message around the Ohio initiative. And we struggled at MPP as well. I was very strongly opposed to the Ohio initiative, and we had a lot of discussions about what exactly the organization's view was going to be on this. And I remember saying to Rob, the reason that I went to go work at MPP instead of Normal or instead of some of these other organizations is that I always saw MPP as sort of the button-down, straight-laced lobbyist, more of a marijuana think tank that looks at what is the best public health policy, what is the best way to make marijuana legal, starting from the default assumption that it should be legal, but what is the best way to do that? And Rob's response was, no, we're an advocacy organization. We think marijuana should be legal. This Ohio initiative makes marijuana legal, so I support it. And that's kind of when I was like, that's where it crystallized for me that we had crossed that point from being on the same team to being on different teams.
And what you're now working in the Congress, are you able to carry that forward? I mean, your ideas of what the ideal legalization would be like?
Yeah, I want to be very careful to say that, I'm here talking, my badge says former marijuana lobbyist, so I'm here, providing my perspective as a former, marijuana lobbyist. I'm not here speaking on behalf of my boss or any member or any committee or the House. But yeah, my boss is on the relevant committee, the Judiciary Committee, so I get to do a little bit of work with staff down there on the issue.
Let me come to you on that, Rob. What is so unreasonable about opposing the Ohio initiative? The concentration of wealth put a lot of people off. You supported it. So what was your case for it versus waiting for something that didn't have that enrichment of that small group of people?
Yeah, so for the record, my view of the Ohio initiative was a personal one. Organizationally, we ended up taking a neutral position, but I personally supported it with reservations. I was not an enthusiast, and in fact, I spent no time on it, but I certainly would have voted yes. And the reason for that is that the Ohio initiative last year, not to be confused with the Ohio initiative this year, which is in fact an initiative that MPP is spearheading for medical marijuana. So we're talking about Ohio, we're talking about last year, oligopoly that Dan mentioned. I support it with reservations because in fact it would have ended prohibition and it would have been good for consumers. So if you're the average person in Ohio and you smoke marijuana, you would much rather that initiative pass, that you could go to a store nearby, you buy marijuana, when you possess it, it's completely legal, you don't have to worry about the cops, etc. It's clearly better from a consumer perspective. So you'd have the access to get marijuana, and then also if you look at the criminal justice system, while Ohio has had a law since the mid-1970s that has had decriminalization for possession, the cultivation of marijuana and the selling of marijuana is all illegal. It all sends you to jail, very likely, but not definitely. And so if we actually are talking about, the Ohio initiative last year, it would have in fact allowed people to grow large quantities of marijuana without actually having to go to jail, selling it and producing it, and ultimately allowing the consumers to buy it. So it actually does accomplish, it would have accomplished a lot of what we all care about, but it wasn't ideal. And there are, in fact, advantages to having seen it fail, which is why I said I supported it personally with reservations. One of the advantages of seeing it fail, and fail big, was that people are now scared off from this stupid oligopoly idea, and so even people who don't care at all about civil liberties or the user's perspective are in fact going to think twice before going for the oligopoly, which I think is good news for probably almost everyone who's engaged in this issue.
Normal, I'm sorry we don't have anyone from Normal on this panel because they wrote kind of an anguished public statement. It was really powerful, I thought, about how they ultimately decided to endorse it with a lot of reservations that this was sort of against their culture and, which is a little more anti-capitalist, I suppose, or skeptical of capitalism. Do you mind talking a little about how MPP decided to be neutral versus, say, going all in or opposing?
Well, I mean, the easiest way to explain why we didn't go all in is because I knew it was going to lose.
Okay.
So, I mean, I told the folks a year before Election Day, when they were soliciting our support, is that I kind of gave them a quick tutorial on why they were going to lose. I said, first, you wrote the initiative where you're predetermining who the winners and losers are, so that's going to be offensive to everyone except for 15 rich guys, who are the winners. Second, oligopolies of any kind, whether you're pre-selecting them or not, isn't probably a very good idea. It's going to be offensive to some portion of the electorate. And furthermore, you're choosing the wrong election. You don't want to put a marijuana initiative in an odd-numbered year election because the voter turnout is low, which means old people vote, young people don't vote, and marijuana gets wiped out. So you can't do a controversial marijuana initiative in 2015. You'd have to do it in 2016 or 2020. So I gave them that tutorial. They didn't care, and that's because they were consultants who were going to get paid if they work on an initiative, and they don't get paid if they don't work on an initiative. So one of the many reasons why I felt good about not working on that is that it was a guaranteed loser, and we are busy actually changing laws around the country, and we don't want to just sink our money into that kind of nonsense.
Would you consider, get to Christian, go ahead.
Rob, can I grab it? Sure. So back to what Dan said, if you think about the oligopoly model, I'm going to say something maybe counterintuitive or intuitive for most people. And this goes for anyone who's looking for a demand or a reduction of demand or not increasing demand. An oligopoly, actually, the whole concept behind it and the thing that's offensive about it for a lot of people was that they would be able to control prices and be able to maximize their profits. And so in a model where you're talking about a state-run model as an alternative because you don't see massive competition, inevitably price competition, which is good for consumers, or we consider it to be good for consumers, but also prices. That's why tax policy when it comes to alcohol, tobacco, other things is one of the most effective tools to reduce actual use or to reduce demand. So in Denver right now, that the city of Denver is actually making an oligopoly argument saying it probably would be better if there was consolidation and there were fewer businesses because that would stabilize or increase prices. As opposed to using tax policy to do so, they're actually making the argument, and a lot of that comes from the rhetoric you hear from people saying, next big tobacco and a lot of it. So they're against marijuana and they actually don't like that it's happening. They'd rather it just sort of settle where it is or that there be fewer number of people to regulate. That will bring prices up because of the lack of competition. So when Dan says, sorry to pick on you, Dan, but when Dan says, that the profit, the profit motives and then being very much against the Ohio ballot and not wanting to see an increase in demand, that's the type of place, if it goes into one of those models, that's where you see prices high. That is where it actually has some of the similar impacts or similar reductions in demand. In Colorado North Plains, there's thousands of stores or whatever, there's like 500. But because of that, that's where you see the most price competition, that's where you see the most innovation, and that's where you see people on the fringes marketing to the wrong groups of people, the people that we don't want them to market to. Now we fix that through policy and other things, but it's complicated. And right now, all I want is for the people that say this is the next big tobacco, Kevin Sabat and others, I was in Vienna with him, all we want is for them to come to the table and work. It doesn't mean you're endorsing what we're doing and say, okay, what would you do to fix it? Western attorneys general and attorneys general are now the consumer advocates. Come to the table and say, you don't have to say you like it, but tell us what we should do to put some of the things we can do under American law in play.
Dan?
Yeah, just to quickly respond, I mean, the difference between a private oligopoly and a public monopoly is the private oligopoly still has
In market participants and market structure, we would like to see. But one thing that is probably the single biggest limiting factor is federal law. So marijuana remains a crime under federal law. That means, and the way preemption works under federal law, public entities actually cannot participate in the marijuana market. There's this one quirky example of a town in Washington that is running a marijuana store, and there are arguments that I don't find terribly persuasive that might be permitted. But the idea of a sort of Uruguay-style system, you simply couldn't do that in the United States because of federal law. The other consequence of having federal criminal law still nominally applied to marijuana activity is that it limits who participates in the market. The companies that choose to grow or sell marijuana even in Colorado or Washington or Oregon, these are companies that have a very high tolerance of risk compared to most companies because you're committing a federal crime by virtue of being in this business. Now, because of the current prosecutorial guidelines under the current president, it's pretty much guaranteed that you're not going to get prosecuted for that crime. But that could change. And so there's not really the openness to try to structure the market in the ways that I think many of us would like to see. So one of the most important things in getting to an ethical and functional market of whatever your vision is to change federal law, and probably in the near term, to change it in a way that there are state-by-state exemptions, where the Attorney General says, not just we'll look the other way and not prosecute, but indeed we're going to waive federal law and say that it is entirely legal, at least for a period of time in a particular place, to conduct a marijuana business that follows the federal guidelines. All of that, I think, would make a huge difference in moving the industry farther and farther away from sort of the horror show of big tobacco and towards what I'm putting out there as a notion of an ethical, responsible industry that provides the consumer choice that Rob is talking about, but also isn't marketing to children or trying to have demand take off in the way that, say, John Calkins is worried about.
Aaron, I'm sure you spend a lot of time in Washington. How do you read the current federal landscape in terms of whether there's a critical mass of people willing to let you become fully legitimate businesses, give you access to banking, let you deduct your expenses, those kinds of things?
There's certainly more and more traction every year on those issues, especially the banking issue, which I think at this point everybody agrees that these businesses should have access to banking, whether they even believe that the businesses have a right to exist because of the public safety hazard. And a lot of the challenges we face are more Congress problems than cannabis problems at this point around banking, in that the Congress hasn't been too terribly functional and bills languish in committee. But we're still, I think, at least 5 years away from seeing actual statutes changed that would allow states to move forward. And then just to kind of speak to what others have been talking about, the Ohio initiative is, we remain neutral, but I was actually personally happy that the outcome was that that initiative failed, because I did not want to see, I think it was Rob that mentioned that would, this scared off this others from doing this kind of a tactic, and I think that setting the precedent that we could, put 10 licensees in the state constitution up front was not something that would have been good for the industry, the movement, or consumers in the long run. And we want to see innovation in this industry, and I think that something that might set NCIA apart from, or me apart from Dan, is that I'm starting with the fundamental premise that cannabis is by far safer alternative to opioid pain medicine, alcohol, and all of these other intoxicants that are out there. And if we can, in a secure, safe, and responsible way, provide that alternative to patients or to adults, and if even just a small fraction of them replace their use of opioids or alcohol with cannabis, it's huge public health impacts there.
Do you see yourself as in competition with the alcohol industry?
No, I don't think
I mean, as if that came true, right, then they would be your enemy, right? If it is true that more cannabis means less alcohol.
Some could look at it that way. I don't think, I think that the market.
You are a man who's been to Washington. That's a very Washington kind of answer. Let me just ask, do you advocate?
Bipartisan support now. It's no longer just Democrats that are supporting industry regulatory reform. And in the city of Denver, what we have is they're still saying, this is federally illegal. This is not a free market. And because of that, they're actually trying to think, they're not succeeding that well right now, but we're working on it. But they're trying to think in innovative ways and new ways that they otherwise wouldn't. They rubber stamp similar policies that they've addressed for other things. So they're trying to think outside the box. Again, sometimes that goes in terrible directions. Sometimes it goes in good directions. Right now in Denver, we're going to incorporate policies and procedures today. An amendment's going to be offered to get, an amendment passed or a bill passed to allow modest expansion of the industry in Denver. That's going to include written policies and procedures by cannabis companies about how to incorporate people who have otherwise been excluded from the industry or who were traditionally communities that were traditionally hurt by cannabis prohibition and enforcement of cannabis prohibition. These are making those industry players actually think about it, even if that policy and procedure is not ultimately followed. But it's that type of innovative thinking, that's the opportunity right now. Colorado's advertising laws are most certainly not allowed under either our state constitution or the federal constitution in terms of commercial speech. Mm-hmm. That being said, the industry is not challenging those, so we need to move now towards self-regulation before that becomes, there's motivation by private actors to do it. And right now, the people at the table and the people that are the thought leaders on this and the industry leaders on this, they want a responsible industry. And so there's a real opportunity being missed, I think, by a lot of opponents generally, or people that want to move towards responsible regulation in the future by not participating, because now is the time that this is happening.
So I'm sure people say to you, Christian, people are skeptical. I've been hearing about industries being responsible for years, and then then oil gets dumped into the sound, safety rules are violated, congressmen are virtually bribed, those kind of things. So why should I believe you, as a skeptic, why should I believe you that your industry is going to be responsible when so many other industries aren't?
I'm not going to respond to the question in the way maybe, well, here's what I'll say. Because it's happening, and because good people are working on it, and because I come from a place, and as do many of the people that I work with, come from a place of good faith. And if you ask, Andrew Friedman was around, and I think I don't want to put him on the spot, or his assistant, who's the governor, the marijuana czar, when in 2013, 2014, and if you ask him now, they've told us being the Amendment 64 campaign and the iteration of our continuing to represent the realm, if you will, of Amendment 64, that we are some of the best government people, good government people that they've worked with. And that we have taken positions contrary. You can look at history when every one of my edibles companies fired me because we combined forces with the No on 64 campaign, a offshoot of Project SAM called Smart Colorado, in order to raise the issue about edibles and be out front on issues that we saw coming. We take positions counter to industry, and industry people get it too, and they are responsible people. So you simply just look at the history. And it has happened. Does that mean in the future it will continue to happen? Everyone says, okay, now, yeah, sure, you do-gooders are doing this now, wait till the big money gets their hands on it. Well, guess what? We can set a precedent now, and it's hard to break that momentum, especially self-regulatory momentum. If you create a system of self-regulation that is very responsible, the idea that big business is going to come in, it's much easier to message against that if you are trying to address real issues. It's happening right now, so if you don't trust me, ask Andrew Friedman about what the marijuana industry is in terms of good government. Not everybody, but some of us. And look at the stories that have come out about us. We ran 2 campaigns. A lot of people don't talk about the second campaign that we ran, which was Prop AA. That was the tax that, the 10% sales tax, 15% excise tax. That was run by the same team that ran, Brian Vicente, myself, and a few other people. That was not nearly as fun as the Amendment 64 campaign, but we raised the money. 50% of the money that went into that campaign came from our law firm and people that we raised money from. Mm-hmm. So it's
Well-intentioned people who I like and call friends. I hope they call me a friend as well. But that's changing over time. As this industry grows, Aaron said earlier that it's not movement versus industry. Industry is part of the movement. He's absolutely right. And as the industry grows and gets bigger and bigger, it's becoming a bigger and bigger part of the movement. And it's attracting different people. It's attracting people who don't care about drug policy issues. It's attracting people who, haven't thought about marijuana as anything other than an opportunity to get very, very, very rich, or richer than they already are. So he's right that now it's comprised of well-intentioned people, but that's changing pretty rapidly.
And do you see that also affecting the movement as well as the law?
Yeah, definitely. When I left MPP, there was this characterization of my comments as saying, the movement has been bought off by the industry. I don't think that's true. I said yesterday on my other panel that it's, not to pick on Rob, but Rob's a free market guy, always has been. It's not that once the industry came along, Rob was bought off by the industry. But it's true that the industry contributes more and more money. It's true that the industry has the ear of policymakers, and right now policymakers are guys up here who write ballot initiatives. It's not state legislators because they're not willing to get involved. And so they get to buy things. They get things in their initiative. Rob talked about being consumer advocacy group. Well, a lot of consumers like the ability to grow marijuana, and we're upset about Arizona initiatives because they can't grow marijuana because the industry bought a provision in the initiative saying you can't grow marijuana if you're within a certain distance of a dispensary. Even outside the marijuana industry, if you read the Nevada initiative, it says, for 18 months, the department shall issue licenses for marijuana distributors only to persons holding a wholesale dealer license pursuant to Chapter 369 of NRS. What is Chapter 369 of NRS? That's the liquor statute. So in Nevada, the only people who can be marijuana distributors are alcohol distributors, and that got in there because the alcohol distributors came to MPP and said, we'd like to have exclusive rights to distribute. Can we write you a big check for that? So, that's the way that policy gets made, unfortunately.
Rob, a chance to respond to that.
So that part there wasn't true. Actually, it wasn't that the alcohol distributors came to us and tried to buy us off. I actually solicited them. So the goal here is to legalize marijuana. And right now, the campaigns, even this far into a 4-year cycle, are still not funded. So when we were drafting the Nevada initiative a couple years ago, we had no money. And so I thought, well, let's see, who can we get money from? The traditional philanthropists are starting to get distracted because they think that legalization is inevitable. I hate that word. It's not inevitable. The industry, either the folks who have just started businesses, either are poor or they claim to be poor. Those who actually are making money have been crass enough to say, my business is doing so well that I want to reinvest the money to actually build my business rather than giving back to the cause that made me legal in the first place.